When we think about a crime, it seems pretty straightforward, right? If you did the thing, you're guilty. But what if I told you that in the eyes of the law, that's not always the case? That what's going on inside your head can be just as important, if not more important, than what you do with your hands. Today, we're going to unravel a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, all because of that very question. So let me introduce you to a guy named Morrisette. He corrected 3 tons of what he saw as rusty, old metal from a government bombing range. In his mind, he was just cleaning up some junk to make a few bucks. The federal government, though, they saw it very differently. They called him a thief and charged him with a felony. So who was right? Was it an honest mistake or was it a federal crime? That's the puzzle we're going to piece together. All right, to really get this, we've got to go back to that day at the bombing range in Michigan and see exactly how this whole thing started. So picture this. Morrisette is a World War II vet. It's 1948, and he's out deer hunting on government land. The hunt doesn't go so well, so to try and cover the cost of the trip, he spots these old, spent bomb casings. And we're not talking about a neat pile here. They were just heaped up, rusting away for years. So he figures, hey, this is just junk. He loads them up, takes them home, flattens them with a tractor, and sells them for scrap. And get this, he does it all right out in the open. No sneaking around, no hiding. And for all that work, 3 tons of metal, all that labor, you want to know what he made? $84. That's it. And for that $84, he was staring down a federal charge that could put him away for years. Kind of wild, right? So when the case gets to trial, Morissette's defense is simple. He says, look, I honestly thought it was abandoned. I had zero intention of stealing anything. But the judge, he wasn't having any of it. He basically told the jury that what Morissette thought didn't matter one bit. The judge's logic was, you took property from government land without permission. That's it. Guilty. Period. End of story. And that right there brings us to the giant legal question at the heart of this. Can the system just ignore what was going on in your head? Can you really be found guilty of a serious crime like theft if you genuinely believed you were doing nothing wrong? Well, to answer that, we have to break down the basic recipe for a crime. So yeah, think of a crime like a recipe with 2 absolutely essential ingredients. The first one is what the lawyers call the actus reus, which is just a fancy Latin term for the guilty act. This is the physical part, the part you can actually see. You see, the law doesn't punish us for just having bad thoughts. Thank goodness, right? You have to actually do something or, in some pretty specific cases, fail to do something. But the key word here, the thing that really matters, is that the act has to be voluntary. It has to be something you chose to do. So what does voluntary even mean? Well, sometimes it's easier to understand it by looking at what it's not. For example, if you have a seizure and your arm flies out and hits someone, that's not a voluntary act. Or if you're sleepwalking and you knock something over, again, not voluntary. The law gets that if you don't have conscious control over what your body is doing, you can't be held criminally responsible for it. Okay, so that makes sense for actually doing something, but it brings up another interesting question. What about doing nothing at all? Can you get into legal trouble by just standing there? Well, the answer is yeah, sometimes you can, but it's only in a few very specific circumstances. Generally speaking, the law doesn't force you to be a good Samaritan, but there are 5 big exceptions. First, a statute or a law can force you to act. Think about filing your taxes. Second, a contract can create a duty, like a lifeguard who's paid to watch the water. Third, a special relationship, like a parent has to a child. Fourth, if you voluntarily take on the care of someone, you can't just abandon them. And last, if you're the one who created the danger in the first place, you've got a duty to help. If your situation doesn't fall into one of those buckets, doing nothing usually isn't a crime. Okay, so we've got the guilty act. That's ingredient number 1. But for most serious crimes, that's only half the recipe. Now we get to the second part, the part that was everything in Morissette's case, the mens rea, or the guilty mind. Now this idea isn't new, it's ancient. It's the belief that for an act to be truly criminal, it needs to have a guilty mind behind it. You know, what the old law books called a vicious will. It's the difference between accidentally bumping into someone on the street and deliberately shoving them to the ground. Same physical result, totally different intent. And that intent changes everything. And this brings us right back around to Mr. Morrisette. The trial judge said his state of mind was irrelevant, but Morissette's whole defense was that for a crime like theft, the state of mind, the intent, is the only thing that matters. This huge disagreement is exactly why the Supreme Court had to step in and decide once and for all, is a guilty mind a necessary ingredient for this crime? So, how did the Supreme Court figure this out? Well, they did it by basically explaining that in the eyes of the law, there are two totally different flavors of crime, and their entire decision hangs on understanding this one distinction. And this chart lays it out perfectly. On one side, you have your classic common law crimes, stuff that's been considered wrong for centuries, like theft, assaults, murder. They're called mala in si, which just means they're wrong in and of themselves. For these, criminal intent is absolutely essential. But then, on the other side, you've got these public welfare offenses. These are usually more modern, regulatory things, like selling mislabeled food. They aren't inherently evil, they're just wrong because a law says so, for public safety. And for these, your intent often doesn't matter. It's what's called strict liability, and the penalties are way smaller.
So the Supreme Court's big job was to figure out which bucket Morissette's crime belonged in. Was taking government property a minor regulatory issue like selling bad milk, or was it just a modern name for an old-school crime? The court looked at the law and said, yeah, this is just theft. It's larceny, and larceny is the textbook example of a common law crime that absolutely requires a guilty mind.
So once the court made that connection, the path forward was pretty clear. So what was the final word for Mr. Morissette and his $84 worth of scrap? Boom. The Supreme Court unanimously reversed his conviction. They said the trial judge made a massive mistake. Why? Because for a crime like this, a crime that's basically theft, you cannot have a crime without criminal intent. You just can't take that question away from the jury. Justice Robert Jackson, who wrote the decision, put it so powerfully. He said this idea, that a real crime needs intent, isn't some new, fleeting idea. He said it's as deep and fundamental to our legal system as the belief in free will itself, our core belief that people choose to do right or to do wrong. So here's the bottom line, the legacy of this case. For serious crimes rooted in common law, a judge can't just look at what someone did and declare that they had criminal intent. Nope. Figuring that out is a question of fact, and it belongs to the jury, and only the jury. They have to weigh all the evidence and decide for themselves what was really going on in the defendant's mind. But this whole case leaves us with one of the biggest, most fascinating challenges in all of law. The Supreme Court made it crystal clear that what's in your mind is critical. But that raises the huge question. How can 12 jurors, or any of us for that matter, ever really climb inside someone else's head and know for sure what they were thinking? It's a puzzle our justice system has to try and solve every single day.